The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the White House West Wing as Karoline Leavitt walked down the hallway toward her new office. At 27 years old, she had just become the youngest White House press secretary in American history. The weight of this achievement felt both exciting and terrifying as she passed the portraits of former presidents lining the walls. Her high heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way to the press secretary's office. It was smaller than what previous press secretaries had used, but Karoline didn't mind. She was grateful to be here at all. Just a few years ago, she had been a college student writing for her school newspaper. Now she would be speaking for the President of the United States to the entire world. Karoline's assistant, Amy Rodriguez, was already at her desk when she arrived. Amy had worked in the White House for 8 years and knew how things worked around here. She looked up from her computer and smiled warmly at her new boss. "Good morning, Karoline. Your schedule is on your desk. You have a staff meeting at 9, then prep time for today's briefing at 11. Karoline nodded and walked into her office. The room was painted a soft cream color with dark wood furniture. On her desk sat a stack of briefing notes, news articles, and talking points prepared by her team. She had been doing this job for only 1 week, but already she could feel the intense pressure that came with it. Every word she said would be analyzed by reporters, political experts, and millions of Americans watching on television. One mistake could become headline news. One wrong answer could create a crisis for the administration. The responsibility felt enormous. Meanwhile, across town in the Capitol building, Senator Adam Schiff was having his morning coffee in his office. The 64-year-old California Democrat had been in politics for nearly 30 years. He had served in the California State Senate, then in the House of Representatives for over 20 years, and now, as a United States Senator, Schiff's office was filled with awards, photographs from important events, and books about politics and law. On his desk sat the morning newspapers, all featuring stories about the new administration's first week in office. Several articles mentioned Karoline Leavitt and her historic appointment as the youngest press secretary ever. As Schiff read these articles, he shook his head slowly. He had been watching Leavitt's press briefings on television, and he was not impressed. To him, she seemed too young, too inexperienced for such an important job. The press secretary position required someone who understood the complex world of Washington politics, someone who had dealt with foreign leaders and national security issues for years. His chief of staff, Tony Williams, knocked on the door and entered the office. Tony had worked with Schiff for over a decade and could usually tell what his boss was thinking just by looking at his face. "Senator, you have that look again," Tony said with a slight smile. "What's bothering you this morning?" Schiff held up one of the newspapers. The front page had a large photo of Karoline Leavitt standing at the White House podium, looking confident and professional despite her young age. "This whole situation with the new press secretary," Schiff said, setting down the paper. "Tony, I've been in this town for 3 decades. I've seen what happens when inexperienced people are put in positions they're not ready for. It doesn't end well." Tony sat down in the chair across from Schiff's desk. He had heard his boss express these concerns before, but today Schiff seemed more frustrated than usual. "The press secretary job isn't something you learn as you go," Schiff continued. "When she stands at that podium, she's representing America to the world. Foreign leaders are watching. Our allies and enemies are listening to every word. This isn't the time for on-the-job training." As the morning went on, Schiff couldn't stop thinking about what he saw as a serious problem. During a meeting with other Democratic senators, the conversation turned to the new administration's communication strategy. Senator Lisa Murphy from Oregon mentioned that she had been watching the press briefings too. "I have to admit she seems to handle the reporters pretty well," Murphy said. "She's poised and stays calm under pressure." Schiff disagreed strongly. "Lisa, being poised isn't enough. This job requires deep knowledge of policy, foreign affairs, national security. You need to understand how Washington really works. She's been here for 1 week. 1 week. How can she possibly be ready to speak for the president on complex international issues?" Other senators in the room listened as Schiff expressed his concerns. Some nodded in agreement, while others seemed less sure. Senator Robert King from Minnesota pointed out that many successful politicians had started young and learned quickly. Adam, maybe we should give her a chance, King suggested. She did work in the White House before during the first Trump administration, and she ran for Congress herself. That's more experience than some people have. But Schiff was not convinced. Running for Congress and actually serving are two very different things. Working as a junior staffer and being the press secretary are completely different jobs. The stakes are too high for this kind of gamble. After the meeting, Schiff walked back to his office feeling even more concerned. He believed that someone needed to speak up about this situation. The American people deserve to have experienced qualified people in important government positions. In his view, putting someone so young and inexperienced in such a crucial role was unfair to the country. That afternoon, Schiff received a call from Sandra Williams, the host of a popular morning television show called Morning Politics. Sandra had covered Washington for 15 years and often interviewed senators and other political figures about current events. "Senator Schiff, we'd love to have you on the show tomorrow morning," Sandra said. "We're discussing the new administration's first week, including their communication strategy. Would you be interested in sharing your thoughts?" Schiff thought for a moment. This would be a perfect opportunity to express his concerns about the press secretary's situation. Someone needed to ask the tough questions about whether this appointment was really in the best interest of the country. "Yes, Sandra. I'd be happy to come on the show," Schiff replied. "I think there are some important issues we need to discuss about experience and qualifications in government." As he hung up the phone, Schiff felt satisfied that he would finally be able to voice his concerns publicly. He believed that by speaking out he would be doing his duty as a senator to hold the administration accountable. Back at the White House, Karoline was finishing her preparation for the next day's press briefing. She had no idea that Senator Schiff was planning to criticize her on national television. She was focused on studying policy details and practicing answers to questions the reporters might ask. Her communications team had warned her that some people in Washington might question her qualifications because of her age. But so far, most of the coverage had been positive. The reporters seemed to respect her knowledge and professionalism. As she packed up her briefing materials for the day, Karoline felt confident about her ability to do this job well. She had worked hard to get here, and she was determined to prove that she belonged in this role. Neither Karoline nor Schiff knew that their paths were about to cross in a very public way that would capture the attention of the entire political world. The next morning arrived cold and gray in Washington. Senator Adam Schiff woke up early in his home in the suburbs. He had been thinking all night about what he wanted to say on the television show. This was his chance to speak directly to the American people about his concerns. After his morning coffee and a quick review of the news, Schiff got dressed in his best navy blue suit. His driver picked him up at 7:30 to take him to the television studio downtown. During the car ride, he went over his talking points one more time. He wanted to be clear and direct about why experience mattered in government. At the same time, across town at the White House, Karoline Leavitt was starting her day. She had no idea what was about to happen. Her morning routine was the same as always. She reviewed the daily news summary, checked her emails, and prepared for the staff meeting. Amy Rodriguez brought her a cup of coffee and the morning schedule. "You have a quiet morning today," Amy said. "Just the staff meeting and then prep time for your 1 o'clock briefing." Karoline smiled and thanked Amy. She was getting more comfortable with the routine of the job. The first week had been challenging, but she felt like she was finding her rhythm. The reporters seemed to respect her, and she had handled their questions well so far. At the television studio, Senator Schiff arrived and was taken to the makeup room. The show's producer, Mike Thompson, came to greet him and explain how the interview would work. "Senator, we're so glad you could join us this morning," Mike said. "Sandra will ask you about the new administration's first week. Feel free to share your honest thoughts about their policies and approach." Schiff nodded. "I'm looking forward to it, Mike. I think there are some important things the American people need to hear." At 8 o'clock sharp, the show began. Sandra Williams sat across from Senator Schiff in the bright television studio. Behind them was a backdrop showing the Capitol building and the show's logo. Cameras focused on both of them as the red recording light came on. "Good morning, I'm Sandra Williams, and this is Morning Politics," Sandra said to the camera. "With me today is Senator Adam Schiff from California. Senator, Thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me, Sandra. Schiff replied with a serious expression. Sandra started with general questions about the new administration's policies. Schiff gave thoughtful answers about immigration, the economy, and foreign policy. But Sandra could tell he had something specific he wanted to discuss. Senator, let's talk about the administration's communication strategy, Sandra said. What do you think about their approach so far? This was the moment Schiff had been waiting for. He leaned forward slightly and looked directly into the camera. Sandra, I have to be honest with you and with the American people, Schiff began. I'm very concerned about some of the personnel decisions this administration has made, particularly when it comes to the press secretary position. Sandra raised her eyebrows. She could sense this was going to be interesting. Can you elaborate on that, Senator? Schiff took a deep breath. Look, Sandra, experience matters in this town. It matters a lot. When you put someone with so little experience in such a crucial role, you're essentially asking the American people to trust their government to someone who is still learning the basics of how Washington works. He continued, his voice growing more serious. I've been watching these press briefings over the past week, and frankly, it's concerning. This isn't an internship program. This isn't a place where you learn on the job. The White House press secretary speaks for the President of the United States to the entire world. Sandra could see that Schiff felt strongly about this issue. Are you saying you don't think Karoline Leavitt is qualified for the job? I'm saying that qualifications matter, Schiff replied firmly. We need seasoned professionals in these positions, not someone who's figuring things out as they go. When foreign leaders are watching, when our allies and enemies are listening to every word, we can't afford to have someone who doesn't fully understand the weight of what they're saying. Schiff's voice became more passionate. I've been in this town for 30 years, Sandra. I've seen what happens when inexperienced people are put in positions they're not ready for. It doesn't end well for anyone, especially not for the American people. But Senator, Sandra interrupted, she did work in the White House before during the first Trump administration. Doesn't that count as relevant experience? Schiff shook his head. Working as a junior staffer and being the press secretary are completely different jobs. The responsibilities are entirely different. The stakes are much higher. Every word she says can move markets, affect international relations, or create diplomatic problems. He leaned back in his chair, looking directly at the camera again. The American people deserve better. They deserve someone who has the experience to handle the complex issues that come across that podium every day. Someone who understands foreign policy, national security, and the delicate nature of international relationships. Sandra asked a few more questions, but Schiff kept returning to his main point about experience and qualifications. The interview lasted 20 minutes, and by the end, it was clear that Senator Schiff had serious doubts about Karoline Leavitt's ability to do her job effectively. Within minutes of the show ending, clips from the interview began appearing on social media. Political reporters and news organizations picked up the story immediately. The main clip that everyone was sharing showed Schiff saying, "We need seasoned professionals, not someone learning on the job." By 9:30 in the morning, the story was trending on Twitter. The hashtag #TooYoungForTheJob started spreading across social media platforms. People were taking sides, some agreeing with Schiff and others defending Leavitt. Cable news networks began running the clips on repeat. Political commentators started debating whether Schiff was right to question Leavitt's qualifications, or if he was being unfair to a young woman trying to do her job. At the White House, word of Schiff's comments reached Karoline's team quickly. Her deputy communications director, Marcus Chen, burst into her office during the staff meeting. "Karoline, we have a situation," Marcus said, looking worried. "Senator Schiff just went on television and basically said you're not qualified to be press secretary." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Karoline, waiting to see how she would react. She had been in politics long enough to know that attacks like this were part of the job, but it still stung to hear someone question her ability so publicly. "What exactly did he say?" Karoline asked calmly. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the clip. Karoline watched Schiff's comments without changing her expression. Inside, she felt a mix of anger and determination. She had worked hard to get to this position, and she wasn't going to let anyone suggest she didn't belong here. The reporters are going to ask you about this at today's briefing, Marcus warned. We need to figure out how you want to respond. Karoline looked around, the room at her team. These people had been working in Washington for years, and they were all looking to her for leadership. She realized this was a test, not just of her ability to handle criticism, but of her ability to lead under pressure. Let's finish this meeting first, Karoline said calmly. Then we'll figure out the best way to handle this. But even as she tried to focus on other business, Karoline's mind was racing. She knew that how she responded to Schiff's attack would define her early days as press secretary. She needed to be smart, strategic, and strong. The entire political world would be watching to see what she would do next. By noon, every major news outlet was covering the story. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How would the youngest press secretary in history respond to such a direct challenge from one of the most experienced politicians in Washington? By noon, the White House was buzzing with activity. News of Senator Schiff's television interview had spread like wildfire through the building. Staff members whispered in hallways, and phones rang constantly as reporters called for comments about the senator's harsh criticism of Karoline Leavitt. Karoline sat in her office with her senior team, trying to stay focused despite the chaos outside her door. Her communications director, Susan Blake, had been fielding calls from reporters all morning. Her deputy, Marcus Chen, was monitoring social media and tracking how the story was spreading online. The clips from Schiff's interview have been viewed over 2 million times already, Marcus reported, looking at his laptop screen. Every major news network is running the story. They're all asking for your response. Amy Rodriguez knocked on the door and entered with a worried expression. Karoline, I've got reporters calling nonstop. CNN, Fox News, NBC, ABC, The Washington Post, The New York Times. They all want to know if you're going to respond to Senator Schiff's comments. Karoline remained calm on the outside, but inside she was carefully thinking through her options. She had learned during her congressional campaign that the first response to an attack was often the most important. If she responded too quickly, she might say something she would regret. If she waited too long, people might think she couldn't handle the pressure. What's our scheduled briefing time today? Karoline asked. 1 o'clock, Susan replied. That's less than an hour from now. Good, Karoline said. That gives us time to think this through properly. Her chief of staff, David Brooks, spoke up. Karoline, we could postpone the briefing if you need more time to prepare a response. Karoline shook her head firmly. No, we're not running away from this. If Senator Schiff wants to question my qualifications in public, then I'll respond in public. But we're going to do it right. She stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the White House lawn. She could see reporters and camera crews setting up outside, preparing for what they expected would be a dramatic confrontation. Here's what we're going to do, Karoline said, turning back to her team. We're going to handle this professionally. We're not going to get into a shouting match or a personal attack. We're going to address his concerns directly and factually. Marcus looked concerned. Karoline, he basically said you're not qualified to do this job. The reporters are going to ask you about that directly. What are you going to say? Karoline smiled for the first time that morning. I'm going to tell them the truth. And then I'm going to remind everyone what qualifications really matter in this job. For the next 45 minutes, Karoline and her team prepared for what everyone knew would be the most important press briefing of her young career. They went over possible questions, discussed talking points, and planned how to handle the most difficult moments. At 12:45, Karoline left her office and walked down the hallway toward the briefing room. She could hear the noise from the press corps even before she reached the door. The room was packed with reporters, camera operators, and photographers. Every major news organization had sent their top political correspondents. As Karoline entered the briefing room, the conversations stopped and cameras focused on her. She walked to the podium with confidence, carrying her notes and briefing materials. The room was so quiet that the only sound was the clicking of camera shutters. Good afternoon, everyone, Karoline said, looking out at the packed room. I hope you're all having a good day. Some reporters smiled at her casual greeting, but most remained focused and serious. They were here for one thing, and everyone knew it. Karoline began with her usual routine, announcing the president's schedule for the afternoon and providing updates on various policy initiatives. She spoke about upcoming meetings with foreign leaders, new economic proposals, and legislative priorities. For 20 minutes, she handled routine questions about government business. The reporters grew restless. They were waiting for someone to ask about Senator Schiff's comments, but Karoline was sticking to her normal format. Finally, Danny Rodriguez from CNN raised his hand. "Yes, Danny," Karoline said, pointing to him. Danny stood up, and the room became completely silent. "Karoline, Senator Schiff appeared on television this morning and questioned your experience and qualifications for this job. He said you're too inexperienced to be press secretary. How do you respond to his criticism?" Every camera in the room focused on Karoline's face. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Political reporters who had covered Washington for decades later said they could feel the tension in the room. Karoline paused for just a moment, looked directly at Danny, and then turned to address the cameras. Her voice was calm and steady. "Well, Danny, I appreciate Senator Schiff's concern about experience in government," she began. "But I'd like to remind everyone that experience isn't always measured simply by the number of years someone has served in Washington," she continued, her confidence growing with each word. "I've had the privilege of working in the Trump White House before, where I learned directly from some of the most experienced political professionals in the country. I served as communications director for a member of Congress where I dealt with complex policy issues and media relations on a daily basis." The room remained silent as she spoke. "I also ran a competitive federal campaign for Congress myself, which taught me how to communicate effectively with voters and handle intense media scrutiny. Throughout that campaign, I participated in dozens of debates, interviews, and public forums where I had to discuss complex policy issues under pressure." Veteran reporter Helen Baker from The Washington Post was taking notes rapidly. She had covered 5 different administrations and recognized that Karoline was building toward something bigger. "But more importantly," Karoline continued, "the President of the United States chose me for this role because he trusts my judgment, my communication skills, and my ability to represent his administration effectively to the American people and to the world." She paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with several reporters. "The President could have chosen anyone for this position. He chose me because he believes I can do this job well. And I intend to prove him right every single day." Another reporter, Patricia Lee from NBC, raised her hand. "But Karoline, don't you think Senator Schiff has a valid point about the importance of experience in such a crucial position?" Karoline nodded thoughtfully. "Patricia, I absolutely agree that experience is important, but there are different types of experience. Some people gain experience by sitting in Washington for decades. Others gain experience by working directly with the American people, by running campaigns, by communicating complex ideas to diverse audiences." Her voice became more passionate. "I've spent my career learning how to communicate effectively, how to handle pressure, and how to represent the views and values of the people I serve. That's exactly what this job requires." The room was completely focused on her every word. Political commentators watching on television later said, this was the moment when Karoline transformed from someone defending herself into someone taking control of the narrative. "However," Karoline added, and the room leaned forward slightly, sensing that something important was coming, "if Senator Schiff wants to have a conversation about qualifications and track records, I'm certainly willing to engage in that discussion." The reporters exchanged glances. They could sense that Karoline was preparing to go on the offensive, but they weren't sure what she meant. "Are there any other questions about today's policy announcements before we wrap up?" Karoline asked, as if the most dramatic moment of the briefing hadn't just occurred. Several reporters raised their hands, but most of them were thinking about what Karoline had just said about being willing to discuss qualifications and track records. It sounded like a challenge, and everyone in the room knew that the story was far from over. The briefing room remained tense as Karoline continued taking questions from reporters. Most of them were still thinking about her comment regarding qualifications and track records. The way she said it sounded like a warning, but no one was. sure what she meant. Reporter after reporter asked follow-up questions about Senator Schiff's criticism, but Karoline handled each one professionally. She talked about her experience, her qualifications, and her commitment to serving the American people, but everyone could sense that she was holding something back. Finally, veteran reporter Robert Chen from the Wall Street Journal raised his hand. Robert had been covering politics in Washington for over 20 years. He had interviewed presidents, senators, and Supreme Court justices. He knew when someone was preparing to make a big move. "Yes, Robert," Karoline said, pointing to him. Robert stood up slowly. "Karoline, you mentioned being willing to discuss qualifications and track records. It sounds like you have something specific in mind. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?" The room became completely silent. Camera operators adjusted their equipment to make sure they captured every angle. This felt like the moment everyone had been waiting for. Karoline looked around the room one more time. She could see the faces of dozens of reporters, all focused entirely on her. She knew that whatever she said next would be replayed on television for days and analyzed by political experts across the country. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Since Senator Schiff has chosen to make this conversation about experience and qualifications," Karoline said, her voice steady and clear, "I think it's fair to examine his own track record and see how it measures up." The tension in the room increased immediately. Every reporter in the room knew that Karoline was about to go on the attack, but they weren't sure what direction she would take. Senator Schiff spent the better part of 4 years telling the American people that he had seen clear evidence of criminal conspiracy between the previous Trump administration and Russia. Karoline continued. He appeared on dozens of news shows, held countless press conferences, and repeatedly assured the American people that he had proof of serious crimes. Patricia Lee from NBC was writing frantically in her notebook. She could see where this was going, and she knew it was going to be big news. Senator Schiff, as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, had access to classified information that most Americans couldn't see, Karoline said. He used that position to make very serious accusations against a sitting president. He told the American people to trust him because of his experience and his access to secret information. The room was so quiet that the only sounds were the clicking of camera shutters and the soft scratching of pens on paper. But when the Mueller investigation concluded after 2 years and millions of dollars, where was that evidence Senator Schiff claimed to have? Karoline asked. When Special Counsel Robert Mueller couldn't find proof of the conspiracy that Senator Schiff said was obvious, what happened to all those confident predictions? Danny Rodriguez from CNN was leaning forward, in his seat. He had covered the Russia investigation extensively and knew exactly what Karoline was referring to. And when the Durham investigation was completed, Karoline continued, what did we learn about the foundation of those claims that Senator Schiff made so confidently? What did we discover about the sources and methods that led to years of investigations and accusations? She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before continuing. The American people waited for years to see the evidence that Senator Schiff promised them. Families across this country were told that their government might have been compromised by a foreign power. People lost faith in their elections, their institutions, and their leaders because of the serious accusations that Senator Schiff made repeatedly and confidently. Helen Baker from the Washington Post looked up from her notes. She had covered the Russia investigation from the beginning and remembered Senator Schiff's many television appearances where he insisted he had seen evidence of collusion. So when Senator Schiff questioned someone else's credibility, Karoline said, her voice growing stronger, I think it's reasonable to ask about his own track record. When he talks about the importance of experience and qualifications, we should probably examine how he used his own experience and qualifications. The room erupted with activity. Reporters began typing on their laptops and sending messages to their editors. Camera operators zoomed in to capture Karoline's expression. Everyone realized they were witnessing a major political moment. The American people deserve press secretaries who tell them the truth, Karoline continued, looking directly into the main camera. They deserve government officials who keep their promises and deliver on their commitments. They deserve leaders who don't spend years making accusations they can't prove. She paused again, gathering her thoughts for what everyone sensed would be her strongest point. So when Senator Schiff wants to question someone's credibility and qualifications, Karoline said, perhaps he should start by explaining his own track record to the families who waited years for the evidence he claimed to have. Perhaps he should explain to the American people why his confident predictions didn't match the final conclusions of the investigations he supported. The silence that followed was deafening. Even veteran reporters who had covered dozens of presidential administrations later described this moment as one of the most effective political responses they had ever witnessed. Marcus Chen, watching from the back of the room, felt his heart racing. He had worked in political communications for 15 years, but he had never seen someone deliver such a devastating response with such calm professionalism. "Are there any other questions?" Karoline asked, as if she hadn't just delivered what would become one of the most talked about moments of the entire administration. Several reporters raised their hands, but most of them were too stunned to think of immediate follow-up questions. The response had been so comprehensive and so well delivered that it would take time to fully process what had just happened. "Thank you all very much," Karoline said, gathering her notes. "We'll see you tomorrow." As she walked away from the podium, the room exploded with noise. Reporters immediately began calling their editors and producers. Camera crews started packing up their equipment to rush back to their newsrooms. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would dominate the news cycle for days. Outside the briefing room, Karoline's team was waiting for her with expressions of amazement and excitement. Susan Blake looked at her with new respect. "Karoline, that was incredible," Susan said. "I've never seen anything like that." Amy Rodriguez was practically bouncing with excitement. "The phones are already ringing off the hook. Every news organization wants to interview you about what you just said." But Karoline remained calm and focused. She knew that what she had just done would have major consequences. Senator Schiff would probably respond, and the political battle would likely escalate. She had chosen to fight back, and now she had to be prepared for whatever came next. "Let's get back to the office," Karoline said quietly. "We have work to do." As they walked down the hallway, Karoline could hear the noise from the briefing room behind them. She knew that within minutes, clips of her response would be circulating on social media and cable news. The question now was how Senator Schiff and his supporters would respond to her counterattack. The political world was about to find out just how far this confrontation would go. Within minutes of the press briefing ending, the political world exploded with activity. Video clips of Karoline's response were being shared thousands of times on social media. News organizations were breaking into regular programming to show highlights of what reporters were already calling a historic moment. At CNN headquarters in Atlanta, the afternoon news team was scrambling to put together a special report. The network's political director, Sarah Martinez, was watching the clips over and over again on her computer screen. "This is huge," Sarah told her team. "We need to get our best political analysts on this immediately, and someone needs to reach out to Senator Schiff's office for a response." Similar scenes were playing out at Fox News, NBC, ABC, and every other major news organization. Editors and producers were canceling other stories to focus on what everyone knew would be the biggest political story of the week. Back at the White House, Karoline was in her office with her senior staff, monitoring the immediate reaction to her response. Amy Rodriguez was tracking social media, while Marcus Chen was fielding calls from reporters and political commentators who wanted interviews. "The clip has been viewed over 500,000 times in just the first 30 minutes, Amy reported, looking at her computer. "The responses are mostly positive. People are calling it brilliant, devastating, perfect." Susan Blake was on the phone with producers from 3 different television networks. "Everyone wants you to come on their shows tonight," she told Karoline. "They're calling this one of the most effective political responses they've ever seen." But Karoline wasn't ready to celebrate yet. She knew that the real test would come when Senator Schiff and his supporters responded. Political battles in Washington often went back and forth for days, and she wanted to be prepared for whatever came next. "What are we hearing from Capitol Hill?" Karoline asked David Brooks, her chief of staff. "Schiff's office is being flooded with calls from reporters," David replied. "So far they haven't issued any statement, but I'm sure they're working on something." Meanwhile, in Senator Schiff's office across town, the atmosphere was much more tense. The senator had been in meetings all afternoon and was just learning about Karoline's response. His communications director, Jennifer Walsh, was showing him clips on her tablet. "Senator, this is getting a lot of attention," Jennifer said carefully. "The reporters are asking for your response to her specific points about the Russia investigation." Schiff watched the clips with a serious expression. He had not expected such a direct and well-prepared counterattack. Karoline had clearly done her homework and had delivered her response with remarkable skill for someone so young. "What are the political commentators saying?" Schiff asked. "It's mixed," Jennifer replied.
"Some are saying she handled your criticism perfectly. Others are saying she went too far by attacking your record. But most are saying she came across as strong and confident." Schiff's senior advisor, Tom Richards, entered the office looking
worried. "Senator, we've got a problem. The trending topics on social media are not good for us. People are talking more about your Russia investigation comments than about her qualifications." As the afternoon continued, it became clear that Karoline's response was having a major impact. Political polling companies were already conducting quick surveys to measure public opinion. Cable news shows were bringing in experts to analyze every word of her statement. At 5 o'clock, the first poll results came in. A major polling organization had asked 200 registered voters a simple question. "Do you think Karoline Leavitt effectively responded to Senator Schiff's criticism?" Wow. Results were striking. 68% of respondents said yes, she had effectively responded. Only 24% said no. Even more surprising, the response was popular across party lines, with significant numbers of Democratic voters saying they thought her response was effective. Rachel Torres, a political commentator on an evening news show, was one of the first to recognize the broader significance of what had happened. "This is more than just a political argument between two government officials," Rachel told her television audience. "This is a perfect example of what happens when experienced politicians underestimate their opponents." Senator Schiff thought he was dealing with an inexperienced young woman who would be easy to intimidate. Instead, he ran into someone who was fully prepared to fight back. By 6 o'clock, Karoline was ready to make her next move. She had been waiting to see how the initial reaction developed, and the response had been even more positive than she had hoped. "I want to do one television interview tonight," she told her communications team. "Something that will let me explain my response in more detail and show people that this wasn't just a lucky moment." Susan Blake had already been thinking about this possibility. "I've got 3 networks offering primetime interviews. Which one do you want?" "Let's go with the one that has the biggest audience," Karoline decided. "I want as many people as possible to hear what I have to say." At 7:30 that evening, Karoline appeared on the most-watched cable news show in the country. The host, Bill Stevens, had been covering politics for 25 years and was known for asking tough questions. "Karoline, thank you for joining us," Bill began. "Today you delivered what many people are calling one of the most effective political responses in recent memory. Walk us through your thinking." Karoline looked comfortable and confident on camera. "Bill, when Senator Schiff chose to question my qualifications publicly, he opened a conversation about what really matters in government service. I simply wanted to remind people that credibility comes from keeping your word and telling the truth, not just from having a long resume. But some people are saying you went too far by bringing up the Russia investigation," Bill pressed. "Do you think that was appropriate?" "Absolutely," Karoline replied without hesitation. Senator Schiff spent years making very serious accusations. He told the American people he had evidence that he never produced. If he wants to question other people's credibility, his own track record is certainly fair game for discussion. The interview continued for 15 minutes, with Karoline handling every question with poise and confidence. By the time it ended, even more people were talking about her performance. But the moment that would be remembered most came near the end of the interview, when Bill asked her if she had anything else to say to Senator Schiff. Karoline paused for just a moment, looked directly into the camera, and delivered the line that would define the entire controversy. Senator Schiff spent 4 years telling America he would save democracy, but couldn't save his own credibility. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Bill Stevens, who had interviewed presidents and foreign leaders, later said it was one of the most memorable moments he had ever witnessed on live television. The line was perfect in its simplicity and devastating in its impact. Within an hour, it was being quoted on every major news program and shared millions of times on social media. By the end of the evening, it was clear that Karoline had won the political battle decisively. Senator Schiff's office issued a brief statement saying he stood by his concerns about experience in government, but they notably avoided responding to any of her specific criticisms. The next morning's newspaper headlines told the story. Young press secretary delivers knockout punch. Leavitt turns tables on Schiff. Experience versus credibility. Leavitt wins. Political analysts were already calling it a defining moment that had established Karoline as a force to be reckoned with in Washington. For Senator Schiff, it was a reminder that in politics, sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones you underestimate. The confrontation that had started with questions about age and experience had ended with a demonstration that political skill and preparation matter more than time served. Karoline Leavitt had proven that she belonged on the biggest stage in American politics.